All right, so buckle up because today we are diving deep, and I mean deep, into some next-level geopolitical strategizing.
Definitely not your average Tuesday read, that's for sure.
Not even close.
Yeah.
We're talking about an article called What Putin Should Do, and let me tell you, it's a wild ride.
Oh, it does not hold back. It really throws out some creative solutions, let's call them that.
If by creative you mean potentially starting a war with drug cartels,
Yeah.
then yeah, super creative.
Well, you've got to hand it to them for thinking outside the box, but to really grasp where the author is coming from, we have to back up a bit and look at the context. They paint this picture of Russia being in a pretty vulnerable position right now, largely because of everything happening in Ukraine.
Makes sense. It's been all over the news, the sanctions, the international pressure, all that.
Exactly. And the author argues that the U.S. is using this to their advantage, trying to isolate Russia on the world stage. They even have a name for it, Prometheanism, they call it.
Prometheanism.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're just using big words to sound smart.
No, it's a real thing, or at least
Yeah.
the author claims it is. Apparently, it's based on this idea from a Polish leader back in the early 20th century who believed the best way to weaken Russia was to stir up internal conflict and divisions.
So it's like the U.S. trying to influence elections or instigate unrest, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, you could see it that way. The author points to a bunch of examples, like the unrest we saw in Kazakhstan a couple years ago, the ongoing tension between Armenia and Azerbaijan, even some things happening in the Balkans. They see it as all part of this larger strategy to keep Russia off balance.
Okay, so if that's the U.S.'s game plan, what's Russia supposed to do about it, besides, the whole cartel thing, which we'll get to, I'm sure?
Well, the author argues that Russia needs to flip the script, shift the pressure back onto the U.S. And how do you do that? You create a distraction so big, so chaotic, that the U.S. has no choice but to divert resources and attention away from Russia.
Enter the drug cartels.
Bingo. The article proposes that Russia should, and I'm just reading directly from it here, provide support to South American drug cartels, provoking a conflict that would force the United States to engage.
So basically the author is saying, let's give the U.S. something else to worry about a little closer to home.
Exactly. The idea being that a full-blown cartel war on their doorstep would force the U.S. to focus inward, giving Russia some breathing room on the international stage.
It's a bold strategy, that's for sure.
Bold is one way to put it.
But, strategically speaking, it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're playing a game of Risk and you want to fortify your own territory, you create some chaos somewhere else on the board to distract your opponent.
I like that analogy. It really highlights the kind of strategic thinking the author is engaging in here. And it speaks to a larger point they make about the current geopolitical landscape. They see it as this battle between what they call continental powers, basically the U.S., Russia, and the European Union.
And to play in that league, you need to be a major power yourself, or at least very tightly aligned with one.
Right. And Russia, in their view, is at risk of being squeezed out.
Right. And the author seems to think that right now, the U.S. might be especially vulnerable to that kind of pressure.
You mean because of all the political stuff happening over here? That's definitely part of it. The author talks about how divided the U.S. is right now and how that could make it harder for them to deal with a major crisis, especially if they're already busy with something like, well, a cartel war on their southern border.
So it's about hitting them where it hurts when they're already distracted.
That's the idea. Create enough chaos that the U.S. can't keep up. Now, I want to be clear here. The article doesn't say this would be an automatic win for Russia. It's more about evening the odds, forcing the U.S. to react in a way that benefits Russia, even if it's just buying them some time and space.
Okay, so we've talked about the weakening the U.S. part of the author's argument. But I have to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on the whole multipolar world thing they keep coming back to. What exactly does that mean in this context?
That's a great question, because it's a crucial part of the author's overall point. Basically, they see this whole strategy as a stepping stone toward a world where power isn't concentrated in the hands of one dominant country, like, say, how the U.S. is positioned right now.
Instead, they'd rather see.
Yeah.
But like a bunch of different countries calling the shots.
In a way, yes. The author believes that a multipolar world, one with several centers of power, would be more stable, less prone to large-scale conflict.
Because no one country could just throw its weight around and boss everyone else.
Exactly. Imagine a world where China has just as much influence as the U.S., or where a bloc of countries like the European Union really starts acting as a united, powerful force. That's the kind of shift the author is envisioning.
And they think this whole Russia-backed cartel war situation is going to make that happen.
Well, from their perspective, it's about weakening the U.S. enough that other powers, like Russia, like China, have the space to become more assertive on the world stage. It's about changing the balance of power, ultimately.
I gotta say, that's a pretty wild theory. But I guess that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, right? It really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about global politics.
I agree. Whether you agree with the author or not, just engaging with this kind of out-of-the-box thinking, it's a good reminder that the world is complex. There are always different perspectives, different agendas at play, and understanding those perspectives, even the ones we might find unsettling, is essential if we want to make sense of the world around us.
No kidding. It's definitely a lot to process. But I think that's part of what makes this whole conversation so valuable, right? Even if you don't agree with every single point the author is making, it forces you to think critically, to question your own assumptions about how the world works.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point of exploring these kinds of ideas, right? It's not about blindly accepting or rejecting them. It's about using them to sharpen our own understanding of the world around us.
So it's like a mental workout, but for geopolitics.
I love that analogy because it really is. It's about challenging ourselves to look beyond the surface, to consider perspectives we might not have considered before.
Well, this whole article definitely made me realize just how much I don't know about the whole Russia-Ukraine situation.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew it was complicated, but this really takes it to another level.
And I think that's something that's easy to forget when we're bombarded with headlines and news stories. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day developments and lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's like that saying, can't see the forest for the trees.
Exactly. Sometimes you need to step back and look at the whole forest, try to understand the forces shaping the landscape, even if they're not always immediately visible.
So how do we do that? How do we get better at seeing those bigger forces at play, especially in something as complex as geopolitics?
I think it starts with curiosity, with asking questions, even uncomfortable ones, with seeking out different perspectives, even if we don't agree with them, and with being open to the possibility that the world might be a lot more complicated than we initially thought.
Not always easy, but definitely important.
Hmm.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me today. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
The feeling is mutual. I always appreciate the chance to dig into complex issues with you.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.